All right, so unfortunately, we might hear something from up there. It sounds like someone's using a hammer. I don't know when they'll be done. Anyways, time has come. There's no UFC card this weekend. It's a Saturday with no fights. Well, no UFC fights. There are fights. I'll be watching fights later. But that means that I'm going to talk about UFC Fighter Pay. Also recording the audio for this in case I decide to do a podcast with it. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. We'll see. And this is always a complicated topic because there's a lot of sides to it, and rightfully so. There's a lot of people that don't care about fighter pay, which I can get. There are a lot of people who believe the fighters deserve more and will bring up moral and fair ideas for why that is. I'm going to touch on those, but that's not a motivation for the UFC or any major corporation. So it's not super relevant in that regard. And there are people who will take they signed the contract. Why are we talking about this approach? Which is also somewhat fair. It's cold, but it's fair. Or I should say logical, reasonable. Maybe those are better words for it. And then you have the group that does annoy me because this is the group that either argues in bad faith, doesn't read the argument you're trying to make, or is just conditioned to support the UFC without question. And that's the group that says fighters don't deserve more. Fighters only work once a year, ignoring the whole process of what goes into making a fight. Fighting isn't a full-time job, or people who just will dispute the numbers. I'm going to present as facts. And the reason I'm presenting them as facts is that the UFC doesn't dispute them. These numbers come from antitrust litigation against the company, journalism done by various MMA reporters, most notably John Nash of Bloody Elbow, and the UFC's own shareholder meetings and financials, because it's a publicly traded company now. The numbers are the advantages of a publicly traded company. Obviously, you can sell stock and get shareholder investment and make a lot of money. But it also does mean that there's a certain amount of public disclosure that didn't used to be there and that we do have. So let's get into the numbers that frame this discussion. And this is where I guess the fairness and the morality argument comes in. Most professional sports, be that the NFL, the NBA, the MLB, whatever, do a roughly 50% player promotion league owners revenue split. And this is the only thing you can compare the UFC to. This is the only remotely tangible comparison you can have because the business is the same. Physical activity, sport. In the case of the UFC, it's a little bit more sports entertainment, but essentially sport. You could say the WWE, I guess, is the fairest comparison. But even their split is probably higher, actually. I've not looked into it because I think number one, people get offended when you try to bring pro wrestling and MMA to the same kind of level. And two, there is a big difference because WWE being pro wrestling, being predetermined to being scripted, means that they literally can determine what's happening. So the role of the wrestler is much less. Whereas in MMA, yes, the UFC brand is important. Yes, people will watch UFC without really any regard for who the fighters are. But the reason that is the case is that the UFC has had the large majority of the best fighters for years at this point, and they have built that reputation up. That reputation does not exist without fighter quality. It doesn't. If the UFC put on cards suitable for a hook and shoot regional show or a King of the Cage show, they would not have become the UFC. And you need quality fighters for that. So that they're hand in hand. They're not divorceable. If the UFC, if they actually did become a promotion full of Dana White Contender Series fighters and nothing but, they let everyone else go, people would lose interest because we complain about fight quality now. We can complain about the excitement. We complain about the skills now when it's on one of its all-time highs in terms of how good fighters are. Although actually it's scaling down now a little bit because the Dana White's Contender Series replacing Tough as a primary flow has, I think, hurt things, because with Tough, you got more exposure to the weaknesses of fighters and who wasn't capable and who was capable. Whereas Dana White Contender Series, by its format of having just one fight, does mean that you are potentially signing a lot of non-UFC level competition. Anyways, I've delayed. Let's get to the numbers. UFC fighter revenue split is estimated 16 to 21%. This depends on time period. This depends on who's presenting the numbers, but it's in that 5% ballpark. So for ease of math, let's call it 20% for our purposes here. That's compared to 50% for major promotions of sports. And also, I would say, pales in comparison to boxing. So UFC could double its fighter pay while retaining a massive profit margin. Now, why should they do that? Well, we'll get to that in a sec. The UFC also controls about 90% of major MMA revenue, compared to, the Bellators of the world and so on. So there should be no competitor. Legitimately speaking, the fact that Bellator, One, etc., have ever signed a UFC fighter away from the UFC is an indictment of their policies. If they raised fighter pay, they would be able to retain fighters more easily and gain a further competitive advantage against other promotions. Because without UFC veterans, it's very hard to build someone. Because when you think about it, people for the longest time talked about Bellator fighters like Eddie Alvarez, Michael Chandler, as if they were not good. Not only were they not the best in the world, but not only were they number 5 on the pound for pound rankings or divisional rankings, but they weren't good, period. Which is, of course, weird because Alvarez came over, won the title. Michael Chandler came over, got a title shot. Admittedly, has only beaten Dan Hooker, but Dan Hooker is still a top 10 lightweight. And then you have other examples where it did work out. Ben Askren did turn out to be not very good, and I think everyone kind of really understood that he was just very, very one-dimensional. And also getting kind of old, and also in semi-retirement. So that wasn't even all that fair. But we saw this also with Pride trying to set up fighters to be bad. And in some cases it worked, some cases it didn't. Talent exists outside the UFC. But the perception is that it doesn't unless you beat former UFC fighters. So by letting their fighters walk, they are actually paying themselves a competitive disadvantage. On top of that, if you think about what the UFC complains about a lot of the time, when a fighter misses weight, or a fighter fights very poorly, or a fighter doesn't take a late notice replacement fight, or a fighter isn't available right away for booking. These are all things that you could fix by making it better pay. Many UFC fighters have other jobs. This means that they have other things in their lives that are immobile, shall we say, inflexible to their UFC career, that they are going to have to take care of before being able to take a fight. The great story of Pat Cummings comes to mind when his manager had to go. I don't remember the restaurant chain, but it was a coffee and donut place, a Dunkin' Donuts or something of that ilk. Had to go to the drive-thru to talk to Cummins to let him know that he'd been offered a fight with Daniel Cormier. That's what we're talking about here. People with full-time jobs. And not good jobs. Like, it's one thing when you have like an Ally Quinta who's doing like the real estate thing, prepping for the future. Great idea, by the way. It's a bit of another thing when you have like Anthony Smith, professional drywaller, while getting a UFC title shot. It's another thing with, fast food restaurant worker and UFC fighter. Or various other things. And yes, some of this probably can be tracked down to failure to manage money, because a lot of people like to say that. You have enough money, you can live on this, blah, blah, blah. I think that there is an incredible disconnect for those people, though, and what actually goes into being a fighter. Because something that seems to never really occur to people is the UFC, well, MMA in general, but predominantly the UFC, supports a completely separate industry of support industries. Fighter nutrition, fighter training, fighter promotion. You got to pay your manager, you got to pay your coach, you got to pay your strength and conditioning coach, you got to pay your nutritionist, you got to stay on weight. There is generally a higher cost associated with the fighter diet than there is with that of a regular person, because you have to plan everything. This is an entire industry that survives off of MMA fighters, which again, 90% of the revenue is the UFC. So yeah, they have to have secondary jobs. And that's going to illy affect your ability to fight at your best skills, your best physical condition, be ready to fight anytime, be able to, at a drop of a hat, go into full fight camp. My hands, of course, are disappearing because of the XSplit cam. Excuse me. And that is an obvious problem. If the UFC paid more, and again, someone in the comments is going to come up with like, oh, you want UFC fighters to make Tom Brady money? No, that's not what I'm talking about. Again, the UFC could double every fighter on the roster and not come anywhere near Tom Brady money. Not come anywhere near NFL money. Not come anywhere near 50%. They'd be at about 40%. That's double. The base contract for the UFC is a sad, paltry 10K contract. 10,000 a show, 10,000 a win. And you'll probably only get booked twice a year. So if you win both your fights, yay, you made 40 grand. I understand that a UFC fighter is not a long-term prospect. And there's no way to make it. Like, literally speaking, unless you were to pay millions of dollars per fight for the undercard guys, there's no way to make UFC fighter a long-term prospect, because the injuries that short-circuit your career, the lack of bookings, the lack of time, the chances of getting cut, these are all things that are going to, at some point, eliminate the idea that you can be a 50-year-old MMA fighter. 40-year-old even. Even 35 is a pretty lucky career. My age right now, had I gone down the MMA route, had I dedicated to it, I would probably not be fighting anymore now. Which makes a lot of sense. My back is bad, my knees are bad. Imagine if I'd actually gone through the weathering of, 20 some odd fights at this point. Probably 30 fights even. It'd be a lot different. So I'm not saying be set for life money. There's no way to make that happen. But there is enough pay that the UFC could put out that at least a UFC fighter is a UFC fighter. That they're nothing else. And there's incredible advantages to the promotion for that. You would probably get less fights falling apart due to injury and illness. Why? Because they could focus, they could have better nutrition, they could have better strength and conditioning. They could have less injuries in training. You would have more fighters available to take the fight at any given notice because it's their job. You would probably have better fighters because, again, you would have better levels of coaching, more training. You would be a better fighter. There is no surprise that fighters at better camps generally do better. Being an ATT fighter, for example, to use a top team, makes you a better fighter. There are fighters from American Top Team who, for the beginning of their career, their pre-ATT days, were not very good. They had gaps in their game that closed when they went to ATT. So, what is the downside to the UFC increasing their current pay structure? I would hypothesize there isn't one. Yes, there's a short-term money downfall because obviously that's, let's not even say 20%. Let's say they increase at Fighter Pay to 30% of revenue. All right, that's 10% of revenue out of the pockets of the owners. Keep in mind, we just got Ari Emanuel and Whitesell and Dana White's share product, and like we're talking 9 figures here. They ain't hurting. And I've always said this. Again, I'm trying not to make a fair morality argument because it has no place. But what if the hypothesis went that yes, we would lose some money now, a drop in the bucket, but we would be in a stronger place. We would have better fights, sell more, and that secure the future of this company even further by having fighters. And this, of course, brings up like unionization and stuff. And I've always said this, that the sad thing about the fighter pay situation is that the fighters have no solution. Because unionization is a time-consuming prospect, at which time the UFC will just fire people. That's my honest opinion. We have seen that if you are pro-union, Leslie Smith is a good example, the UFC will fire you. If you are anti-union, like Sam Alvey, and I had a whole video on Sam Alvey, and again, I like Sam Alvey as a person. I think he's a quirky, probably fun dude to have a beer with. He can be a fun fighter. Although, I said in that video, I think everything fun about him is determined by the opponent. But the reason he has a contract, I think it's twofold. One, they really, really, really do like talking about his model wife. I don't really know why. I feel like it was a really interesting story when it broke. Don't get me wrong, but like we've been hearing about it for years without like additional detail, really in any way. So like I don't really know why it's being hyped on. And the fact that he is one of the fighters who's also a union buster because he defends UFC Fighter Pay, and is, you know what, he probably needs it. And again, they don't really have another option. Because it's not like anyone's going to pay them particularly more. Sure, you could get a little bit more from Bellator. Maybe. If you have the right cachet. Or one. If you have the right cachet. But the fact that that's even true, given how dominant the UFC is in the world of MMA revenue, is kind of ridiculous. So, there's my fighter pay thing. My rant. I actually got it done in less than 20 minutes. Wow. They can pay more. They don't. There would be significant advantages, I think, to paying more. And you could disagree. Again, I'm not here to bring all of MMA fandom on the same side in this regard because diversity is the thing of humanity. We're not going to have the same opinion. But I really do wish this debate was less, I don't want to say civil because it's not necessarily uncivil, less stupid. I don't have a better word for it because, like I said, there are people that are more pro UFC than the UFC is. That's kind of weird. It's kind of bizarre. I hope you enjoyed. And whenever there's no UFC fight card, I will do more of these. And I'm not sure what the next topic would be. I know open scoring is a big thing lately, so probably something to do with open scoring, maybe. So, have a good one. Enjoy the UFC next week. It is both a big and kind of anticlimactic card. But I'll be further about that in my predictions.